Every morning at 7:15 a.m. sharp, Margaret Chen would step out of her modest two-bedroom apartment, adjust her bright orange safety vest, and walk the 3 blocks to Lincoln Elementary School. At 62, she had been the school's crossing guard. For 8 years, and in all that time, she had never been late, never called in sick, and never let a single child cross the street without her watchful eye ensuring their safety. The residents of Millbrook knew Margaret well. She was the woman who waved cheerfully from her corner post, who remembered every child's name, who carried extra Band-Aids in her vest pocket for scraped knees, and who somehow always had the perfect encouraging word for nervous first graders on their way to school. To most people, she was simply the crossing guard, a fixture of their daily routine, as reliable as the sunrise but just as easily overlooked. But Margaret Chen harbored a secret that would have shocked every parent who drove past her intersection, every teacher who smiled and waved from the school windows, and every child who trusted her to guide them safely across the street. 25 years earlier, before she became a crossing guard, before she moved to the quiet suburb of Millbrook, Margaret had been Captain Margaret Chen of the United States Army, a decorated helicopter pilot who had flown countless rescue missions in some of the world's most dangerous conflict zones. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret had never spoken about her military service to anyone in Millbrook. When she applied for the crossing guard position 8 years ago, she had simply listed her previous job as government service and left it at that. The school principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been impressed by Margaret's punctuality, her clear communication skills, and the way she seemed to command respect without raising her voice. What Mrs. Rodriguez didn't know was that Margaret had once commanded a flight crew in the mountains of Afghanistan, or that she had received the Distinguished Flying Cross for her role in a daring rescue mission that saved 17 soldiers from a remote outpost under enemy fire. The truth was, Margaret had deliberately chosen a quiet life after her military retirement. She had seen enough chaos, enough danger, enough split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. The crossing guard job offered her something she had never experienced during her decades of service: predictability. Every day was the same. The children arrived at the same time, crossed at the same corners, and went home along the same routes. There were no surprise missions, no emergency calls in the middle of the night, no lives hanging in the balance of her decisions. Margaret had grown to love this routine. She knew that Tommy Martinez always ran a little late on Tuesdays because of his piano lessons, that Sarah Kim was afraid of the big yellow school bus and preferred to walk, and that the Johnston twins would try to race each other across the street if she wasn't paying attention. She had become part of the fabric of the community, woven into the daily lives of hundreds of families who depended on her vigilance and care. Her apartment reflected this quiet life she had chosen. The walls were decorated with photos of the children she helped cross the street, thank you cards from parents, and certificates of appreciation from the school district. Tucked away in a bedroom closet, gathering dust, were her military medals, her flight logs, and a photo of her standing beside a Black Hawk helicopter in the desert, squinting against the sun, her face younger but marked by the same quiet determination that now characterized her work at the school crossing. Margaret had convinced herself that those days were behind her forever. She had traded her flight helmet for a safety vest, her radio communications for a simple stop sign, and her life-or-death responsibilities for the gentle task of helping children safely navigate their way to and from school. She told herself that she was content with this choice, that she had found peace in the ordinary rhythms of civilian life. But life has a way of calling us back to who we truly are, especially when others need us most. And on one particular Tuesday morning in October, as Margaret took her usual position at the corner of Maple Street and Lincoln Avenue, she had no idea that everything she thought she had left behind was about to become the most important part. of who she was meant to be. The morning started like any other. The autumn air was crisp and clean. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, and the familiar stream of children and parents began making their way toward Lincoln Elementary. Margaret checked her watch, 7:45 a.m., and smiled as she saw the first group of students approaching her corner. She raised her stop sign, stepped into the crosswalk, and began what she thought would be just another ordinary day in her quiet, predictable life. She could not have been more wrong. The sound came first as a distant rumble, barely audible over the typical morning sounds of suburban life: cars starting, dogs barking, children laughing as they walked to school. Margaret was helping a group of third graders cross Maple Street when she heard it, and something deep in her trained instincts made her pause and tilt her head slightly, listening more carefully. Most people would have dismissed it as a passing truck or construction equipment from the new shopping center being built on the other side of town. But Margaret's ears had been trained to distinguish between different types of mechanical sounds, and this one sent a chill down her spine. It was the unmistakable sound of an aircraft engine in distress, sputtering, straining, fighting against some kind of mechanical failure. She completed the crossing with the children, her outward demeanor calm and reassuring as always, but her mind was racing. The sound was getting closer, and more concerning, it was getting lower. Whatever aircraft was making that noise was losing altitude fast. Margaret scanned the clear October sky, her eyes moving in the systematic pattern she had been trained to use during reconnaissance missions. There, to the northeast, maybe 2 miles away, a small dark speck against the blue sky, trailing what looked like a thin stream of smoke. Her heart began to beat faster as she realized what she was looking at. "Mrs. Chen, are you okay?" asked Katie Sullivan, a 4th grader, who had noticed Margaret's sudden stillness. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Margaret replied, forcing a smile. "Just listening to that airplane. You'd better hurry along to school now." But as the children dispersed and made their way to the school building, Margaret couldn't take her eyes off the aircraft. Her military training kicked in automatically, and she began assessing the situation with the analytical precision that had once made her one of the Army's most trusted pilots. The aircraft was definitely in trouble. The smoke trail was getting thicker, and the engine noise was becoming more irregular. Worse, it appeared to be heading directly toward Millbrook's residential area. Margaret pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? "This is Margaret Chen. I'm at the corner of Maple and Lincoln Avenue in Millbrook. There's an aircraft in distress heading toward the residential area, approximately 2 miles northeast of my position. It's trailing smoke and appears to be losing altitude rapidly." "Ma'am, can you describe the aircraft?" Margaret squinted at the sky. Years of aircraft identification training allowed her to make out details that would have been impossible for a civilian to discern. "It appears to be a medical helicopter, possibly a Bell 429 or similar model. The smoke is coming from the rear of the aircraft, likely an engine fire or mechanical failure." There was a pause on the line. "Ma'am, how are you able to identify the aircraft type?" "I have experience with helicopters," Margaret said simply. "What's important right now is that you need to alert the fire department and emergency services. If that helicopter goes down in the residential area, we could have a major disaster on our hands." As she spoke, Margaret's mind was already working through the possibilities. The helicopter was losing altitude, but it was still airborne, which meant the pilot was fighting to maintain control. The smoke suggested engine failure, but the aircraft hadn't fallen into an uncontrolled spin, which meant at least some systems were still functioning. Most importantly, medical helicopters were usually equipped with emergency landing protocols and skilled pilots who were trained to handle exactly this type of situation. But Margaret also knew that even the most skilled pilot would be looking for a safe place to land, and the terrain around Millbrook was far from ideal. The residential area was dense with houses, power lines, and mature trees. The school was surrounded by playgrounds and parking lots full of cars. The nearest open space large enough for an emergency landing was the high school football field. But that was 3 miles away, possibly too far for a helicopter that was already struggling to stay airborne. "Ma'am, we have emergency services en route," the dispatcher said. "Can you stay on the line and provide updates on the aircraft's position?" "Absolutely," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. The aircraft is now approximately 1.5 miles out, still heading southwest. The smoke trail is getting heavier, and the engine noise is becoming more erratic. As she spoke, Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. The elementary school's morning recess was scheduled to begin in just 20 minutes. Hundreds of children would be outside on the playground, completely unaware of the potential danger approaching from the sky. If the helicopter couldn't make it to a safe landing zone, if the pilot lost control, if the aircraft went down in the wrong place at the wrong time, Margaret shook her head, forcing herself to focus. She had spent years training for crisis situations, and she knew that panic and worst-case scenario thinking were the enemies of effective action. What mattered now was staying calm, providing accurate information to the emergency services, and being prepared to help however she could. But as she watched the helicopter struggle across the sky, fighting against mechanical failure and the inexorable pull of gravity, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet life as a crossing guard was about to become something much more complicated. The skills she had spent 8 years trying to leave behind were stirring to life, and she had a growing suspicion that before this day was over, she would need every bit of training and experience she had gained during her military service. Helicopter was now close enough that she could see it clearly without squinting. And what she saw confirmed her worst fears about what was about to happen. Margaret's trained eye could now make out the details that confirmed her worst fears. The helicopter was indeed a medical aircraft. She could see the distinctive red and white markings of Metro Emergency Medical Services, the same company that provided helicopter ambulance services to the entire Tri-County area. This wasn't just any aircraft in distress. This was a helicopter that was almost certainly carrying a patient who desperately needed emergency medical care. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere inside that struggling aircraft was a human being whose life depended on getting to a hospital quickly. The pilot was probably flying a race against time even before the mechanical failure occurred, and now that race had become exponentially more desperate. Every second the helicopter remained airborne with a failing engine was a second closer to potential catastrophe, but every second it took to find a safe landing spot was also a second away from the medical care that could save a life. Margaret's military training had taught her to compartmentalize her emotions during a crisis, but she couldn't help feeling a deep sense of personal responsibility. She had spent 8 years in this community, watching over the safety of its children, becoming part of its daily rhythm. Now that same community was potentially in danger, and she possessed skills and knowledge that could make the difference between tragedy and survival. "Ma'am, are you still there?" The 911 dispatcher's voice brought her back to the immediate situation. "Yes, I'm here. The aircraft is now about a mile out, and I can confirm it's a Metro Emergency Medical Services helicopter. The smoke is definitely coming from the engine area, and the aircraft is losing altitude more rapidly. You need to alert the hospital that they may have an incoming medical emergency that will require ground transport." "We're on it," the dispatcher replied. "Fire and rescue units are en route to the area. Can you estimate where the aircraft might come down?" Margaret studied the helicopter's trajectory, her mind automatically calculating flight paths, wind direction, and the physics of a controlled emergency landing. Based on current heading and rate of descent, the pilot is going to Be looking for an open area in the next few minutes. The most likely options are the Lincoln Elementary Playground, the parking lot at Millbrook Shopping Center, or possibly the athletic fields at the high school if they can maintain altitude long enough. Even as she spoke, Margaret could see the pilot making the same calculations she was. The helicopter's flight path had become more erratic as the pilot began searching for a suitable landing zone. She could almost feel the desperation in the aircraft's movements, the slight banking turns as the pilot evaluated and rejected potential landing sites, the careful management of whatever power remained in the failing engine. And then, with a clarity that surprised her, Margaret realized something that the emergency services couldn't know and the pilot couldn't see from the air. None of the available landing sites were actually safe. The elementary school playground was surrounded by power lines and had a tall fence that would make a ground approach by emergency vehicles difficult. The shopping center parking lot was busy with morning shoppers and delivery trucks, and the overhead power lines there were even more numerous. The high school athletic fields were the best option, but they were also the farthest away, and Margaret could tell from the helicopter's increasingly labored flight that it might not have enough power to reach them. But there was one option that nobody else knew about, a piece of information that Margaret had gathered during her daily walks through the neighborhood. Information that could save lives if she could somehow communicate it to the pilot. 3 blocks east of the elementary school, the city had recently demolished an old factory building to make way for a new municipal park. The demolition had been completed 2 months ago, but the construction of the park hadn't yet begun. The result was a flat, open area approximately the size of 2 football fields, with no overhead obstructions, no power lines, and direct access to the main road for emergency vehicles. It was, in Margaret's expert opinion, the perfect emergency landing zone. The problem was that the site wasn't visible from the pilot's current position, and there was no way for the helicopter to know it existed. The pilot was making decisions based on what they could see from the air, and from their vantage point, all the visible options were problematic. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. The emergency services were focused on responding to wherever the helicopter actually came down, but they weren't in a position to guide the pilot to the best landing site. Air traffic control would be trying to help, but they would be working from charts and satellite imagery that wouldn't show the recent demolition site. The pilot was on their own, making split-second decisions with incomplete information, while fighting to keep a damaged aircraft airborne. In her years of military service, Margaret had been in similar situations, moments when critical information wasn't reaching the people who needed it most, when the difference between success and disaster came down to communication and coordination. She had learned that sometimes the most important thing you could do was to be the bridge between knowledge and action, to be the voice that connected the right information with the right people at the right time. As she watched the helicopter continue its desperate search for a safe landing site, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible just minutes earlier. She was going to stop being a spectator and start being a pilot again. She was going to use every skill she had learned, every piece of training she had received, and every instinct she had developed to help guide this aircraft to safety. The question was whether she could remember enough, act quickly enough, and communicate clearly enough to make a difference. The lives of everyone aboard that helicopter, and potentially everyone on the ground, might depend on how well a crossing guard could remember how to be a pilot when it mattered most. Margaret's hands moved with a muscle memory that surprised her as she pulled out her cell phone and began searching for the emergency frequency information she hadn't used in 8 years. Her military training had included extensive work with civilian emergency services, and she knew that medical helicopters maintained radio contact with both air traffic control and emergency services on the ground. If she could reach the right frequency, she might be able to communicate directly with the pilot. But first, she needed to make sure the landing zone she had in mind was actually available and suitable. Margaret turned to Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had been watching the unfolding drama from her front yard across the street. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to call the school and tell them to keep all the children inside until further notice. There's a helicopter in distress, and we need to keep the playground clear." Mrs. Patterson nodded, her face pale but determined. "Of course, dear. But Margaret, how do you know so much about helicopters?" "I'll explain later," Margaret replied, already moving toward her car. "Right now, I need to get to the old factory site on Oak Street. Can you stay here and direct the emergency vehicles when they arrive?" Without waiting for an answer, Margaret jogged to her 15-year-old Honda Civic and drove quickly through the neighborhood streets, her mind racing through the logistics of what she was about to attempt. The old factory site was indeed perfect, flat, clear, and easily accessible. But she needed to do more than just identify a landing zone. She needed to become an air traffic controller, a ground guide, and a liaison between the pilot and the emergency services. As she pulled into the empty lot where the factory had once stood, Margaret could see the helicopter more clearly. It was losing altitude steadily now, and the smoke trail had become more pronounced. The pilot was running out of time and options. She parked her car at the edge of the lot and got out, immediately pulling out her phone to call 911 again. "This is Margaret Chen again. I'm at the old factory site on Oak Street, 3 blocks east of Lincoln Elementary. This area is perfect for an emergency helicopter landing. Flat, clear, no obstacles, direct road access. You need to guide the pilot here." "Ma'am, we can't direct aircraft movements. Air traffic control handles that." "Then patch me through to whoever can talk to that pilot," Margaret said, her voice taking on the commanding tone she hadn't used in years. "I'm a former military helicopter pilot, and I can see that aircraft is about to go down. This is the safest landing zone in the area, and if that pilot doesn't know about it, people are going to die." There was a pause. Then the dispatcher said, "Hold on, I'm connecting you to our emergency services coordinator." While she waited, Margaret began walking around the perimeter of the open area, her trained eye automatically identifying potential hazards and calculating approach angles. The site was even better than she had remembered, roughly 600 feet long and 400 feet wide, with a surface that was mostly level concrete and packed earth. There were no power lines within a quarter mile, no tall trees to create wind turbulence, and the surrounding streets were wide enough for fire trucks and ambulances to access the area easily. "This is Commander Rodriguez with Metro Emergency Services. I understand you have information about a potential landing zone?" "Yes, sir. I'm at the old factory site on Oak Street in Millbrook. It's an ideal emergency landing zone. Large, flat, clear approach from all directions, no obstacles. The pilot can't see it from their current position, but it's the safest option in the area." "Ma'am, what's your background with aircraft?" "Former Army helicopter pilot, 25 years of service including combat operations. I know what I'm looking at, and I know what that pilot needs right now." There was a brief pause, then Commander Rodriguez said, "We're going to try to relay your location to the pilot. Can you provide precise coordinates?" Margaret rattled off the GPS coordinates she had memorized during her drive to the site, then added, "I can also provide ground guidance if needed. I have signal mirrors in my car, and I can set up a basic ground control setup." "Negative on the ground control, ma'am. We have protocols for this type of situation, but we'll definitely relay the landing zone information. Stand by." As Margaret waited, she watched the helicopter continue its increasingly desperate search for a safe landing site. The pilot had banked toward the high school athletic fields, but Margaret could see that the aircraft was losing altitude too rapidly to make it that far. Any moment now, the pilot would be forced to choose between the marginal options that were visible from the air. Unaware that a perfect landing zone was just minutes away, Margaret made a decision that would have horrified her 8 years earlier. but felt completely natural now. She was going to break protocol and make direct contact with the pilot. During her military service, she had maintained her amateur radio license, and she had kept the handheld radio in her car as a backup communication device. Medical helicopters monitored several emergency frequencies, and there was a chance, a small one, but a chance, that she could reach the pilot directly. Margaret ran back to her car and retrieved the radio, quickly tuning it to the emergency frequency that medical helicopters use for coordination with ground services. She took a deep breath, pressed the transmit button, and spoke in the clear, calm voice that had once guided helicopter missions through some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. Metro Emergency Helicopter. This is ground control at emergency landing zone. If you can hear this transmission, you have a clear landing zone at coordinates ... She repeated the GPS coordinates twice, then added, large, flat, clear area, no obstacles, emergency vehicles en route. Acknowledge if you copy. For a moment, there was only static. Then, through the crackling radio interference, she heard the most beautiful sound she had heard in years, the voice of a pilot in distress who had just been offered hope. Ground control, this is Metro Emergency 1. I copy your transmission. Are you air traffic control? Margaret looked up at the struggling helicopter, now close enough that she could see the pilot through the windscreen, and she made the decision that would change everything. Metro Emergency 1. This is a former military pilot providing emergency ground assistance. I have visual contact with your aircraft and a clear, safe landing zone. Are you ready to accept ground guidance? The pilot's response came immediately, and Margaret could hear the stress and desperation in the voice crackling through the radio. Affirmative. Ground control. We have engine failure, smoke in the cockpit, and a critical patient on board. I need a landing zone immediately. Current altitude 800 feet and descending. Margaret's military training took over completely. The crossing guard who had spent 8 years worrying about nothing more dangerous than jaywalking children disappeared, replaced by Captain Margaret Chen, helicopter pilot and emergency rescue specialist. Her voice became crisp, professional, and utterly calm. Metro Emergency 1, I copy your situation. Turn heading 270 degrees, that's west-southwest. Your landing zone is a clear area approximately 1/2 mile from your current position. Large, flat surface, no obstacles, emergency vehicle standing by. She could see the helicopter beginning to turn, following her guidance. The pilot was trusting her completely, a stranger on the radio who claimed to be qualified to guide them to safety. Margaret felt the weight of that trust, and it focused her mind with laser precision. Ground control, I see the area you're directing me to. It looks clear from here. What's the surface condition? Concrete and packed earth, suitable for emergency landing. Wind is calm, no crosswinds to worry about. You have a clear approach. From the south, that's your best angle, lowest obstacles, smoothest approach slope. Margaret began walking toward the center of the landing zone, her eyes never leaving the helicopter. She could see that the pilot was fighting for control. The aircraft's movements were becoming more erratic as the engine failure worsened. Smoke was now pouring from the rear of the helicopter, and she could tell that they had very little time before the situation became catastrophic. Metro Emergency 1, what's your current altitude? 600 feet and dropping fast. I'm not sure I can maintain controlled flight much longer. Margaret's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. You're doing great, pilot. I can see you clearly now. Begin your approach from the south. Aim for the center of the cleared area. You have plenty of room, no obstacles, and I'll guide you down. As the helicopter began its final approach, Margaret positioned herself where the pilot could see her clearly, using her bright orange safety vest to make herself visible. She had done this dozens of times during her military service, guiding Helicopters into landing zones under far more dangerous circumstances than this. But somehow, this felt more important than all of those missions combined. The helicopter was now low enough that Margaret could see the pilot clearly through the windscreen, a young woman, probably in her 30s, her face tense with concentration as she fought to control the damaged aircraft. In the passenger compartment, Margaret could make out the forms of medical personnel working on a patient, their movements urgent and focused. "You're looking good, Metro Emergency 1. Hold your current heading, reduce speed, prepare for landing. You have 200 feet of clearance on all sides. Ground control, I'm getting some vibration in the controls. This is going to be a hard landing. Understood. Emergency vehicles are standing by. You're almost there. Just hold it steady for another 30 seconds. Margaret could hear the sirens in the distance now. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police. Cars racing toward the landing zone. The emergency services had taken her seriously, and they were preparing for whatever happened next. But for the moment, everything depended on the skill of the pilot and the guidance Margaret could provide. The helicopter was now less than 100 feet above the ground, close enough that Margaret could see the strain on the pilot's face as she fought to control the aircraft. The smoke was getting thicker, and Margaret could smell the acrid odor of burning engine oil and electrical components. They were running out of time. Metro Emergency 1, you're at 100 feet, looking. Good. The landing zone is clear, no obstacles. Bring her down slowly, you're doing perfectly. Ground control, I'm losing power fast. I'm going to have to auto-rotate. Margaret's blood ran cold. Auto-rotation was an emergency procedure that helicopter pilots used when they lost engine power, essentially allowing the helicopter to glide to the ground using the momentum of the spinning rotors. It was incredibly dangerous and required split-second timing and enormous skill. If the pilot misjudged the approach, if they hit too hard, if the rotors hit the ground. Metro Emergency 1, you can do this. I can see you have plenty of room. Hold your approach angle, wait for the right moment, and flare just before touchdown. You're a skilled pilot. Trust your training. The helicopter suddenly dropped faster, the engine noise replaced by the distinctive whirring sound of rotors in auto-rotation. Margaret held her breath as the pilot executed one of the most challenging maneuvers in aviation, bringing the aircraft down in a controlled glide toward the landing zone. 50 feet, looking good. Hold it steady. 30 feet, perfect approach angle. 20 feet, get ready to flare. 10 feet, flare now. The helicopter's nose lifted slightly as the pilot pulled back on the controls, using the last bit of rotor momentum to cushion the landing. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced once, and then settled on the concrete surface with a metallic thud that Margaret felt through the ground beneath her feet. For a moment, everything was silent except for the gradually slowing sound of the rotors winding down. Then Margaret heard the most wonderful sound in the world, the voice of the pilot coming through the radio, shaky but triumphant. Ground control, we're down safe. Everyone aboard is okay. I don't know how to thank you. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the emergency vehicles surrounding the helicopter, as she saw the medical personnel quickly transferring their patient to a waiting ambulance, as she realized that her 8 years of quiet civilian life had led to this moment when her old skills could save lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But even as the relief washed over her, Margaret knew that this was just the beginning. The helicopter was safely on the ground. The patient was being transferred to continue their medical care, and the pilot and medical crew were unharmed. But questions would be asked, explanations would be required, and her carefully constructed quiet life was about to become very complicated indeed. That as the first fire truck reached the landing zone and firefighters began surrounding The helicopter, Margaret realized that she was no longer just a crossing guard who had helped with an emergency. She was about to become the center of a story that would change everything. The emergency scene that unfolded around the landed helicopter was controlled chaos. Fire trucks positioned themselves around the aircraft, their crews ready to respond to any sign of fire or fuel leakage. Paramedics rushed to assist with the patient transfer, while police officers began securing the area and directing traffic away from the landing zone. And in the center of it all, Margaret stood with her handheld radio, still wearing her bright orange crossing guard vest, looking completely out of place among the emergency responders. Captain Sarah Martinez, the helicopter pilot, was the first to approach Margaret after the aircraft was secured. She was a tall woman in her early 30s, with short dark hair and a kind of steady eyes that Margaret recognized from her own military service. As she walked toward Margaret, removing her flight helmet, her expression was a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and professional curiosity. "Are you the person who guided us in?" Captain Martinez asked, extending her hand. "Yes, I'm Margaret Chen," Margaret replied, shaking the pilot's hand. "I'm just glad everyone made it down safely. Just glad." Captain Martinez studied Margaret's face carefully. "Ma'am, what you did was incredible. I've never had ground guidance that precise from someone who wasn't air traffic control. You saved lives today, mine, my crew's, and our patients. Where did you learn to do that?" Margaret hesitated, feeling the weight of 8 years of carefully maintained privacy pressing against the reality of what had just happened. "I have some experience with aircraft," she said simply. But Captain Martinez was persistent. "Some experience? Ma'am, you guided me through an emergency auto-rotation landing like you've been doing it your whole career. That's not some experience. That's serious training. Are you a pilot?" Before Margaret could answer, Commander Rodriguez from Metro Emergency Services approached, followed by Fire Chief Thompson and several police officers. The questions were about to become much more formal and much more difficult to deflect. "Ms. Chen," Commander Rodriguez said, "I need to ask you some questions about what happened here. First, let me say that your actions probably saved lives today. But I need to understand exactly what your qualifications are for providing air traffic guidance." Margaret looked around at the assembled emergency responders, all of whom were clearly waiting for her explanation. The patient had been successfully transferred to an ambulance and was already on the way to the hospital. The immediate crisis was over. But now she faced a different kind of challenge, explaining how a crossing guard had been able to do what she had just done. "I'm a retired military helicopter pilot," Margaret said finally. "I served for 25 years, including multiple deployments in combat zones. I've been trained in emergency aircraft recovery procedures, ground-controlled approaches, and crisis coordination." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Captain Martinez stared at her with new understanding, while Commander Rodriguez pulled out a notebook and began writing. Fire Chief Thompson, who had known Margaret for years as just the friendly crossing guard at Lincoln Elementary, shook his head in amazement. 25 years, Captain Martinez said slowly. "What rank?" "Captain," Margaret replied. "I retired as a captain in 2018. I've been working as a crossing guard here in Millbrook for the past 8 years. Fire Chief Thompson stepped forward, his expression incredulous. "Margaret, I've known you for years. You never mentioned that you were a military pilot. Why didn't you ever say anything?" Margaret looked at the faces surrounding her, emergency responders who had just witnessed her guide a helicopter through a life-threatening emergency, people who had known her only as the quiet crossing guard, who helped their children get to school safely. How could she explain that she had deliberately chosen anonymity, that she had wanted nothing more than to leave her military life behind? "I came to Millbrook because I wanted a quiet life," she said. "I'd spent 25 years in crisis situations. making split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or died. The crossing guard job offered me something I'd never had before: peace, routine, predictability. I thought I was done with emergency situations. Commander Rodriguez looked up from his notebook. But you maintained your radio equipment, your knowledge of emergency procedures. You were prepared for something like this. Old habits, Margaret said with a slight smile. You can take the pilot out of the cockpit, but you can't take the training out of the pilot. I kept my radio license current, maintained my equipment, stayed up on aviation safety protocols. I told myself it was just intellectual curiosity, but maybe somewhere deep down, I knew that someday I might need those skills. Again, Captain Martinez shook her head in wonder. Ma'am, do you realize what you accomplished today? That auto-rotation landing was one of the most challenging maneuvers in aviation, and you guided me through it like you were sitting in the cockpit next to me. Without your help, without that perfect landing zone you identified, we might not have made it. You're a skilled pilot, Margaret replied. You would have found a way to get your aircraft down safely. Maybe, Captain Martinez said, but not without risking lives on the ground. The elementary school playground, the shopping center parking lot, those were the only options I could see from the air, and both of them were surrounded by potential casualties. This site you guided me to, it's perfect for emergency landings. How did you know about it? Margaret gestured toward the cleared area around them. I walk through this neighborhood every day. I noticed when they demolished the old factory, and I've been watching this site ever since. As a pilot, you automatically evaluate potential landing zones wherever you go. It's an occupational hazard. Police Captain Williams, who had been quietly observing the conversation, stepped forward. Miss Chen, we're going to need a formal statement about today's events. But first, I want to ask you about something else. We've had several small aircraft emergencies in this area over the past few years. Nothing as serious as today, but situations where local knowledge and expertise could have been valuable. Would you be willing to work with our emergency services as a consultant? Margaret looked around at the faces of the emergency responders, all of whom were nodding their agreement with Captain Williams' suggestion. These were people who had just seen her in action, who understood the value of her skills and experience. But they were also asking her to give up the anonymity and quiet life she had worked so hard to build. I don't know, she said honestly. I came here to get away from all of this. I wanted to be just a crossing guard, someone who helped children cross the street safely. That was enough for me. But it's not enough for us, Captain Martinez said gently. Ma'am, you have skills that could save lives. Today proved that. You can still be a crossing guard, but you could also be so much more. This community needs someone with your expertise. Margaret looked up at the sky where the helicopter had struggled just an hour earlier, then back at the emergency responders who were waiting for her answer. She thought about the children she helped cross the street every day, the quiet routine that had brought her such peace, the life she had built in Millbrook. But she also thought about the patient who was now on the way to the hospital, the pilot who had trusted her guidance, the potential disasters that her knowledge and experience might help prevent in the future. Can I think about it? She asked. Of course, Commander Rodriguez replied. But Ms. Chen, I want you to know that what you did today was extraordinary. You saved lives, and you did it with a level of professionalism and skill that most people couldn't achieve with years of training. Whatever you decide about the future, you should be proud of what you accomplished today. As the emergency responders began to disperse and the helicopter was prepared for transport to a maintenance facility, Margaret stood alone in the cleared area that had become an impromptu landing zone. The crisis was over, the immediate danger had passed, but she knew that her life in Millbrook would never be the same again. Word of what had happened would spread throughout the community. Parents would learn that the crossing guard who had been watching over their children possessed skills and experience that had just saved lives. The quiet anonymity she had treasured would be replaced by recognition, questions, and probably requests for her help in future emergencies. Margaret sighed and looked at her watch. It was almost 10:30 a.m., and she had been away from her post at the school crossing for over an hour. The morning rush was over, but there would be parents picking up sick children, delivery trucks making their rounds, and the usual mid-morning activity around the school. Her responsibilities as a crossing guard hadn't disappeared just because she had temporarily become a helicopter pilot again. As she walked back to her car, Margaret's radio crackled one more time. It was Captain Martinez calling from the ambulance, where she was being checked by paramedics as a precaution. "Ground control, this is Metro Emergency 1. I just wanted to say thank you again. You gave us a miracle today." Margaret smiled as she picked up the radio. "Metro Emergency 1, this is ... This is Margaret. You and your crew are the real heroes here. You got your patient to safety, and that's what matters most." "Margaret," Captain Martinez replied, "I hope this isn't the last time we talk. I have a feeling the aviation community is going to want to hear about what happened here today." As Margaret drove back toward Lincoln Elementary, she realized that Captain Martinez was probably right. The story of how a crossing guard had guided a medical helicopter through an emergency landing would not stay quiet for long. And when it became public, everything about her carefully constructed quiet life would change forever. By the time Margaret returned to Lincoln Elementary, word of the emergency had already spread throughout the school. Principal Rodriguez was standing in the front office, fielding phone calls from concerned parents who had heard about a helicopter emergency in the area. When she saw Margaret walk through the front doors, still wearing her safety vest but carrying a radio that definitely wasn't standard crossing guard equipment, her expression shifted from relief to curiosity. "Margaret, thank goodness you're safe," Principal Rodriguez said, hanging up the phone. "We heard there was a helicopter crash somewhere nearby. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Margaret replied. "There wasn't a crash exactly. The helicopter made an emergency landing at the old factory site on Oak Street. Everyone aboard is safe." "That's wonderful news," Principal Rodriguez said. "But Margaret, several parents have called saying they saw you at the landing site. They said you were talking to the emergency responders like you were in charge. What happened out there?" Margaret had been dreading this moment. Principal Rodriguez had been her supervisor for 8 years, and in all that time, Margaret had never given her any reason to believe she was anything other than a reliable, punctual crossing guard. Now she was going to have to explain that she had been concealing a significant part of her background. "I was able to help because I have experience with aircraft," Margaret said carefully. "I saw the helicopter in distress and provided assistance to the pilot." "Experience with aircraft?" Principal Rodriguez's eyebrows rose. "Margaret, what kind of experience are we talking about?" Before Margaret could answer, the school secretary, Mrs. Johnson, burst through the door from the main office. "Principal Rodriguez, you need to see this. It's on the news." Mrs. Johnson turned on the television in the office waiting area, and Margaret's heart sank as she saw the breaking news report. The story was already public, complete with aerial footage of the helicopter at the landing site and interviews with emergency responders. What makes this story truly remarkable," the news reporter was saying, "is that the ground guidance that helped save this helicopter was provided not by air traffic control, but by a local crossing guard who, we've just learned, is a decorated military veteran with 25 years of experience as a helicopter pilot." Principal Rodriguez stared at the television, then at Margaret, then back at the television. "Margaret, is this true?" "Are you really a retired military pilot?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, I am. I served for 25 years in the Army, and I was a helicopter pilot for most of that time. I retired in 2018 and came to Millbrook because I wanted a quiet life. "But why didn't you ever mention this?" Principal Rodriguez asked. "In 8 years you never said a word about your military service." "Because I didn't want it to define me," Margaret replied. "I had spent 25 years being Captain Chen, helicopter pilot, crisis manager, emergency responder. When I retired, I wanted to be just Margaret, the crossing guard. I wanted to help children cross the street safely and live a peaceful life. I thought I was done with emergencies and life-or-death situations." The news report continued, and Margaret cringed as she saw herself on camera, standing in the landing zone with her radio, clearly directing the emergency response. The reporter was calling her a hero, praising her quick thinking and expertise. But all Margaret could think about was how her carefully maintained privacy was evaporating in real time. "Margaret," Principal Rodriguez said gently, "I understand why you wanted privacy, but you have to realize that this is going to change things. Parents are going to want to know more about who's been watching over their children. The school district is going to have questions. And frankly, I'm amazed that we've had such an incredibly qualified person working with us, and we never knew." Mrs. Johnson was still staring at the television. "Margaret, they're saying you saved lives today. They're calling you a hero." "I just did what needed to be done," Margaret said. "The pilot and her crew are the real heroes. They're the ones who got a critical patient to safety under impossible circumstances." But even as she spoke, Margaret knew that her protests about being called a hero were falling on deaf ears. The story was already spreading, and she could see in Principal Rodriguez's and Mrs. Johnson's faces that they were beginning to understand the full implications of what had happened. The school's phone rang again, and Mrs. Johnson answered it. "Lincoln Elementary, this is Mrs. Johnson." "Yes, she does work here." "No, I can't give out personal information." "Yes, I understand she's been on the news. Margaret realized that this was just the beginning. The phone calls would continue. Reporters would want interviews, and parents would have questions. Her quiet life was officially over. "Margaret," Principal Rodriguez said, "I think you should take the rest of the day off. You've been through a traumatic experience, and you're going to need time to process what's happened. We can have someone else handle the afternoon crossing." "That's not necessary," Margaret protested. "The children will be expecting me to be there. It's my job." "Your job is important," Principal Rodriguez agreed, "but right now you need to take care of yourself. This is a lot to deal with, and you shouldn't have to face it alone." As if summoned by her words, Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. "Ms. Chen? This is Captain Martinez from the helicopter. I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to call and check on you. I know today was probably overwhelming." "I'm fine," Margaret said, stepping away from Principal Rodriguez and Mrs. Johnson. "How is your patient?" "Stable and receiving treatment at the hospital. The doctors say that if we had been delayed much longer, the outcome could have been very different. You literally saved a life today." Margaret felt tears threatening again. "I'm just glad everyone made it safely. Ms. Chen, I also wanted to let you know that my supervisor wants to speak with you. Metro Emergency Services is interested in discussing a consulting arrangement. We could use someone with your expertise to help us identify and evaluate potential emergency landing sites throughout the county. Captain Martinez, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility again." "I understand," Captain Martinez replied. "But would you be willing to meet with us, just to talk about possibilities? You don't have to commit to anything." Margaret looked through the office window at the school crossing where she had spent 8 peaceful years, then at the television where her image was still being broadcast across the region. Her old life was gone. There was no going back to anonymity now. The question was what she would do with the new life that was being thrust upon her. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I can ask," Captain Martinez replied. And, Miss Chen, thank you again. What you did today was extraordinary. As Margaret hung up the phone, she realized that this was just the first of many conversations she would be having about her future. The quiet crossing guard who had wanted nothing more than to help children safely cross the street was about to become something she had never expected to be again, a public figure, a hero, and quite possibly a full-time emergency responder once more. Margaret's afternoon was unlike any she had experienced in her 8 years as a crossing guard. Instead of standing at her familiar corner, watching children safely cross the street, she found herself at home, watching her phone ring continuously with calls from reporters, government officials, and people she hadn't spoken to in years. The first call that truly surprised her came from Colonel James Morrison, her former commanding officer, who had somehow gotten her number within hours of the news breaking. "Margaret, I just saw the news. I should have known that if there was a helicopter emergency anywhere in a 50-mile radius, you'd somehow end up in the middle of it," Colonel Morrison said, his voice warm with familiar humor. "Hello, Colonel," Margaret replied, feeling a mix of fondness and apprehension. "I was hoping to keep my retirement quiet." "Quiet?" "Margaret, you guided a medical helicopter through an emergency, auto-rotation landing using nothing but a handheld radio and your training. That's not quiet. That's exactly the kind of thing that made you one of the best pilots I ever commanded." Margaret sank into her living room chair, suddenly feeling very tired. "I wasn't trying to be a hero, Colonel. I just saw a situation where I could help, and I did what needed to be done. That's what makes you a hero, Margaret. You've always been the person who does what needs to be done, regardless of the personal cost. But I'm calling because I want to know how you're handling all of this. Are you okay?" The question caught Margaret off guard. In all the chaos of the day, no one had asked her how she was feeling about having her carefully constructed private life suddenly thrust into the public eye. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I came to Millbrook to get away from all of this. I wanted to be just a crossing guard." "And you've been an excellent crossing guard," Colonel Morrison said. "But Margaret, you've also been wasting your talents. You have skills and experience that could save lives, and today proved that. Have you thought about what you want to do next?" Before Margaret could answer, her doorbell rang. Through the window, she could see a small crowd of people gathering on her front lawn, neighbors, parents from the school, and what appeared to be reporters with cameras. "Colonel, I need to go. There are people at my door." "Margaret, be careful with the media. Don't say anything you're not ready to have repeated. And call me if you need anything. I mean that." Margaret hung up and looked out the window again. The crowd was growing, and she could see Mrs. Patterson from across the street talking animatedly to a reporter. News vans were pulling up, and she realized that her quiet residential street was about to become a circus. Her phone rang again. This time it was Principal Rodriguez. Double quotes, "Margaret, are you at home? I'm getting calls from reporters wanting to interview you at the school. I've told them that you're not available for comment, but I think you should know that this story is getting bigger. It's not just local news anymore. I just saw it on CNN." Margaret's heart sank. "CNN? How is this a national story?" "Because it's an incredible story, Margaret. A crossing guard who's secretly a decorated military pilot saves a helicopter full of people using skills she learned in combat zones. It's the kind of story that gives people hope and reminds them that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places." Margaret watched through her window as more people gathered on her lawn. "Principal Rodriguez, I don't know how to handle this. I've never been in the spotlight like this. I know, and I'm sorry this is happening to you. But Margaret, I want you to know that everyone here at the school is incredibly proud of you. The parents, the teachers, even the children are talking about how amazing it is that their crossing guard is a real hero." A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Margaret could see a woman in a business suit standing on her front porch, holding a microphone. I have to go, Margaret said. There's a reporter at my door. Don't feel like you have to talk to them if you're not ready, Principal Rodriguez advised. Take care of yourself first. Margaret hung up and stood looking at her front door, knowing that once she opened it, there would be no going back to the quiet life she had built in Millbrook. But she also knew that she couldn't hide in her house forever. She opened the door to find not just the reporter, but several neighbors, including Mrs. Patterson, the Johnson family from down the street, and Tommy Martinez's mother, all looking at her with expressions of awe and gratitude. Miss Chen, said Mrs. Martinez, I just wanted to thank you. Tommy has been talking about you all day. He said that his crossing guard is the most amazing person in the world, and now I understand why. Margaret, Mrs. Patterson added, we've all been your neighbors for years, and we had no idea what an incredible person you are. You've been watching over our children all this time, and we never knew how qualified you were to keep them safe. The reporter stepped forward. Miss Chen, I'm Sarah Williams from Channel 7 News. Would you be willing to answer just a few questions about what happened today? Margaret looked at the faces surrounding her, neighbors who had become friends, parents who trusted her with their children's safety, and a reporter who wanted to tell her story to the world. She realized that she had a choice to make. She could continue trying to protect her privacy, or she could embrace the platform that had been thrust upon her and use it to do some good. I'll answer a few questions, Margaret said, but I want to make something clear first. I'm not a hero. The real heroes are the pilot and medical crew who risked their lives to save a patient, and the emergency responders who answered the call immediately. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills. But Ms. Chen, the reporter said, you identified the perfect landing zone, established communication with the pilot, and guided them through one of the most dangerous maneuvers in aviation. That's not luck, that's expertise and courage. Margaret thought about how to respond. She could downplay her role, deflect attention, and try to minimize the story. Or she could acknowledge the truth and perhaps use this moment to inspire others. I served my country for 25 years, Margaret said finally. I was trained to handle emergency situations, to stay calm under pressure, and to use my skills to help others. When I retired, I thought I was done with that part of my life. But today reminded me that we never really stopped being who we were trained to be. When people need help, when lives are at stake, we use whatever skills we have to make a difference. And that's exactly what makes you a hero, Mrs. Martinez said. You didn't have to help. You could have just watched and let someone else handle it. But you stepped up and used your training to save lives. As Margaret looked at the faces surrounding her, she began to understand that this wasn't just about her desire for privacy anymore. These people, her neighbors, the parents of the children she helped cross the street, the broader community, were looking at her as an example of something important. They were seeing in her story a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that heroes are often hiding in plain sight, and that the skills and experiences we gain in one part of our lives can be used to serve others in ways we never expected. What will you do now? The reporter asked. Will you continue as a crossing guard? Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of clarity that had been missing all day. I'll continue being a crossing guard because those children still need someone to help them cross the street safely. But I think I'm also ready to do more than that. If my skills and experience can help save lives, then I have a responsibility to use them. The crowd on her lawn began to applaud, and Margaret realized that her quiet life in Millbrook was indeed over. But maybe, just maybe, what was beginning would be even better. The next morning, Margaret woke to find her quiet street still buzzing with activity. News vans were parked along the curb, and she could see reporters setting up for what appeared to be live broadcasts from in front of her house. But what surprised her more was the sight of official vehicles mixed in with the media circus. Government cars, emergency service vehicles, and what looked like a military staff car. Margaret's phone had been ringing since 6 a.m., but she had turned off the ringer and let the calls go to voicemail. Now, as she listened to the messages, she realized that the story had indeed gone national, and people from across the country were trying to reach her. The first message was from a producer at Good Morning America, asking if she would appear on the show. The second was from a book publisher interested in her story. The third was from a veterans organization wanting to honor her at their annual awards ceremony. But it was the fourth message that caught her attention. Ms. Chen, this is General Patricia Hayes, commanding officer of the Army Aviation Center. I'd like to speak with you about some opportunities that might interest you. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Margaret stared at the phone. General Hayes was a legend in Army aviation circles, one of the most respected commanders in the service. Why would she be calling about opportunities? Before she could process this fully, her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw a man in a business suit standing beside Captain Martinez, both of them looking official and determined. Ms. Chen, this is Director Michael Chen from the Federal Aviation Administration, Captain Martinez said when Margaret opened the door. We've been trying to reach you about a matter of national importance. Margaret invited them in, grateful to get away from the cameras and reporters outside. Director Chen got straight to the point. Miss Chen, what you did yesterday was remarkable, not just as a rescue operation, but as a demonstration of a critical gap in our emergency response capabilities. We have excellent pilots and air traffic controllers, but we don't have enough people. With your combination of aviation expertise and ground-level knowledge of local communities. I don't understand, Margaret said. What are you suggesting? Captain Martinez leaned forward. We're suggesting that you consider joining a new program we're developing. It's called the Community Aviation Emergency Response Team, or SUT. We want to place experienced pilots like you in communities across the country, people who can serve as local coordinators for aviation emergencies. You'd still be able to continue as a crossing guard, Director Chen added, but you'd also be trained and equipped to handle situations like yesterday's emergency. You'd be our local expert, our eyes and ears on the ground. Margaret felt a familiar mix of excitement and apprehension. That sounds like a full-time job disguised as a part-time responsibility. We understand your concerns, Director Chen said. But consider this, yesterday, you were the only person in a 50-mile radius who had the knowledge and skills to handle that emergency effectively. What if you hadn't been there? What if you had been on vacation, or sick, or simply not paying attention? The question hit Margaret hard because she had been thinking about it all night. Pure chance had put her in the right place at the right time with the right skills. But emergency situations didn't wait for convenient timing or perfect circumstances. What would this program involve? She asked. Captain Martinez pulled out a folder. Training updates to keep your skills current, communication equipment to coordinate with air traffic control and emergency services, and a network of other CERT members across the region. You'd be our primary contact for this area, but you'd also be part of a larger team. And the time commitment? Most of the time, nothing, Director Chen said. You'd live your normal life, work your regular job, and only get called when there's an aviation emergency in the area. But when you are called, you'd be acting with full federal authority to coordinate emergency responses. Margaret's mind raced through the implications. It was exactly the kind of responsibility she had come to Millbrook to avoid. But it was also the kind of opportunity to serve others that had drawn her to military service in the first place. Can I think about it? She asked. Of course, Director Chen said. But I want to show you something first. He pulled out a tablet and showed her a video that had been recorded at the hospital the previous evening. It showed a young girl, maybe 8 years old, in a hospital bed, surrounded by her family. The girl was smiling and laughing, clearly recovering from whatever medical emergency had required the helicopter transport. "This is Emma Rodriguez," Captain Martinez said. "She's the patient we were transporting yesterday. She had suffered a severe allergic reaction at a school field trip, and time was critical. Without that emergency landing, without your guidance, she might not have made it to the hospital in time." Margaret stared at the video, feeling the weight of what Captain Martinez was telling her. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was a real child whose life had been saved by the decisions made yesterday. "Her parents wanted to thank you," Captain Martinez continued. "They said they can't imagine how to express their gratitude to the crossing guard who helped save their daughter's life." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. "I'm just glad she's okay." "She's more than okay," Director Chen said. "She's alive because you were there, because you had the skills and knowledge to help, and because you chose to act. That's the kind of difference the SUT program could make in communities across the country." As they talked, Margaret found herself thinking about the children she helped cross the street every day. She thought about Tommy Martinez, who was always running a little late, and Sarah Kim, who was afraid of the school bus, and the Johnston twins, who liked to race each other across the street. She thought about how their parents trusted her to keep them safe, and how that trust had expanded yesterday to include much more than just crossing the street. "If I joined this program," she said, "what would happen to my job at the school?" "We've already spoken with the school district," Director Chen said. "They're enthusiastic about having a CERT member on staff. In fact, they're interested in developing an aviation safety curriculum for the students, with you as the instructor." Margaret smiled despite herself. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "We've thought of the important things," Captain Martinez said. "But the most important thing is that you have skills and experience that could save lives. Yesterday proved that. The question is whether you're willing to use those skills to help others." Margaret looked out the window at the reporters still gathered on her lawn, then back at the officials who were offering her a chance to serve her community in ways she had never imagined. The quiet life she had built in Millbrook was already gone, changed forever by the events of yesterday. The question now was what she would build to replace it. "I'll need to discuss this with my supervisor at the school," she said finally. "And I'll need to understand exactly what the training and responsibilities involve. But, yes, I'm interested." Director Chen smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. We'll prepare a full briefing for you, including details about the program, the training requirements, and the support you'd receive. This could be the beginning of something important, Miss Chen." As the officials left, Margaret realized that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The crossing guard, who had wanted nothing more than to help children safely cross the street, was about to become something much more. A guardian, not just of her corner intersection, but of the skies above her entire community. Within 48 hours of the helicopter landing, Margaret's story had spread far beyond Millbrook. The local news coverage had been picked up by national networks, and the story of the crossing guard, who was secretly a decorated military pilot, had captured the public imagination in ways that no one had anticipated. Margaret's phone hadn't stopped ringing. She had received calls from talk show producers, documentary filmmakers, and journalists from major newspapers and magazines. The story seemed to resonate with people across the country who were hungry for examples of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, but it was the personal calls that affected Margaret most deeply. Veterans from across the country reached out to share their own stories of transitioning from military service to civilian life. Parents called to thank her for the example she had set for their children. Teachers wanted to know if she would speak at their schools about aviation safety and military service. The most unexpected call came from Emma Rodriguez's mother. "Miss Chen, I don't know how to thank you for what you did," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice thick with emotion. "Emma is home from the hospital now, and she's doing wonderfully. The doctor said that if the helicopter had been delayed even a few more minutes, the outcome could have been very different. "I'm just glad she's okay," Margaret replied, feeling the familiar swell of emotion she experienced whenever she thought about the little girl whose life had hung in the balance. "She wants to meet you," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "She says she wants to thank the crossing guard who helped save her life." Would that be possible? Margaret agreed immediately. Meeting Emma would help her understand the real impact of what had happened. Beyond all the media attention and official recognition, the meeting was arranged for the following Saturday at the Rodriguez family home. When Margaret arrived, she found Emma to be a bright, energetic 8-year-old who showed no signs of the medical crisis she had survived just days earlier. "Are you really the crossing guard who helped the helicopter?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "I am," Margaret replied. "How are you feeling?" "I'm great. The doctor said I can go back to school on Monday. And my mom said that you used to fly helicopters in the Army." Margaret smiled. "I did, for a long time." "That's so cool. I want to be a pilot when I grow up." "Can you teach me?" The question caught Margaret off guard. Here was a child whose life had been saved by aviation expertise, who was now inspired to pursue aviation herself. It was a reminder that the impact of what had happened extended far beyond the immediate emergency. "I think that's a wonderful dream," Margaret said. "There are lots of ways to learn about aviation, and I'd be happy to help you get started." Emma's face lit up. "Really? You would do that?" "Of course. In fact, I might be starting some aviation classes at the elementary school soon. Would you be interested?" "Yes. Can I be in the first class?" As Margaret spent the afternoon with Emma and her family, she began to understand something important about her new role in the community. The helicopter landing had been just the beginning. The real impact would come from the opportunities to inspire, teach, and serve that grew out of that single moment of crisis. When Margaret returned home, she found a surprise waiting for her. A large package had been delivered, and inside was a custom-made flight suit with her name embroidered on the chest, along with a note from the Metro Emergency Medical Services team. "Ms. Chen, we wanted you to have this as a small token of our appreciation for what you did. You'll always be an honorary member of our flight crew. We've also included a radio headset that's compatible with our communication systems, in case you're ever needed again. Thank you for reminding us that heroes come in all forms, even crossing guards with orange safety vests." Margaret held up the flight suit, feeling the weight of the moment. It was beautifully made, professional quality gear that represented acceptance and recognition from the aviation community she had never really left behind. But more than that, it was a symbol of the bridge she was building between her old life and her new one. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She called Director Chen from the FAA. "I've made my decision about the SEC program," she said. "I'm in." "That's excellent news," Director Chen replied. "We'll begin the paperwork immediately. You'll start with a refresher training course next month, and we'll have you fully operational within 6 weeks. "There's one condition," Margaret said. "I want to develop an aviation education program for the elementary school. If I'm going to be the local aviation expert, I want to use that role to inspire the next generation." "That's a wonderful idea," Director Chen said. "We'll support that program however we can. In fact, we've been looking for ways to improve public understanding of aviation safety. Your school program could be a model for other communities." After hanging up, Margaret walked to her bedroom closet and pulled out the box she had kept hidden for 8 years. Inside were her military medals, her flight logs, and photographs from her years of service. She had put them away when she moved to Millbrook, thinking she was done with that part of her life. Now she realized that she hadn't been running away. From her military service, she had been preparing for a new way to serve. The next morning, Margaret put on her orange safety vest and walked to Lincoln Elementary, just as she had every day for 8 years. But this time, instead of trying to be invisible, she stood a little taller, smiled a little brighter, and acknowledged the waves and honks from passing cars with a new sense of purpose. When the children began arriving for school, Margaret noticed something different. They looked at her with new respect, new curiosity, and new excitement. Word of her story had spread among the families, and the children were seeing their crossing guard in a completely different light. "Mrs. Chen," called Tommy Martinez, "is it true that you can fly helicopters?" "It is true," Margaret replied. "And someday, if you're interested, I might be able to teach you about aviation safety. That would be awesome," Tommy said practically. Bouncing with excitement as the morning progressed, Margaret found herself answering questions about helicopters, about military service, and about the emergency that had changed everything. But she also found herself doing what she had always done best, keeping the children safe as they crossed the street. Principal Rodriguez approached her during the morning break. "Margaret, I've been thinking about your offer to develop an aviation curriculum. The school district is very interested. They want to know if you'd be willing to present a proposal to the school board next month." "I'd be honored," Margaret replied. "I think it's important for children to understand aviation safety, and I'd love to share what I've learned." "There's something else," Principal Rodriguez continued. "The district is also interested in creating a new position for you, Director of Aviation Safety Education. It would involve working with multiple schools in the district, developing curriculum, and serving as a resource for emergency preparedness. You'd still be our crossing guard, but you'd also have a broader role in the community." Margaret felt a surge of excitement. This was more than she had dared to hope for, a chance to serve her community in multiple ways, to use all of her skills and experience, and to inspire others to pursue their own dreams of aviation. "I'm very interested," she said. "When would this position start?" "As soon as your CERT training is complete," Principal Rodriguez said. "We want to make sure you're fully prepared for all aspects of your new role." As Margaret stood at her crossing guard post that afternoon, watching the children walk safely home from school, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. The quiet life she had built in Millbrook was gone, replaced by something much more complex and demanding. But it was also something more meaningful, more connected to her deepest values and skills. She thought about Emma Rodriguez, who wanted to be a pilot. She thought about Tommy Martinez, who was fascinated by helicopters. She thought about all the children who passed through her intersection every day, and how her story might inspire them to pursue their own dreams, to develop their own skills, and to be ready to serve others when the moment came. Margaret realized that her 8 years as a crossing guard hadn't been a retreat from her military service. They had been preparation for this moment. She had learned to care for a community, to understand its rhythms and needs, and to build the trust and relationships that made real service possible. Now she was ready to be more than just a crossing guard. She was ready to be a teacher, a mentor, a community leader, and yes, when necessary, an emergency responder who could help save lives. The helicopter landing had been just the beginning of her next chapter, not the end of her story. As the last child crossed safely to the other side of the street, Margaret looked up at the sky and smiled. Tomorrow she would begin her new life as both a crossing guard and so much more. She couldn't wait to see what adventures lay ahead. 6 weeks later, Margaret stood in the briefing room at the Regional Aviation Training Center, wearing her new CERT uniform and feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness she hadn't experienced since her early days of military training. The refresher course had been more intensive than she had expected, covering not just updated aviation procedures, but also modern emergency communication systems, coordination protocols with civilian agencies, and the legal frameworks that governed emergency response operations. "Captain Chen," said Instructor Williams, using Margaret's former military rank, You've completed the training program with the highest scores we've seen. Your combination of practical experience and theoretical knowledge makes you an ideal candidate for the SATE program. Margaret smiled at hearing her old rank again. For 6 weeks, she had been surrounded by aviation professionals who understood her background and respected her experience. It had been refreshing to be valued for her expertise rather than seen as just a crossing guard with an unusual hobby. Thank you, sir. I'm ready to begin serving my community in this new capacity. There's one more thing, Instructor Williams continued. We've received a request from the Department of Defense. They want to feature your story in a recruitment video for military veterans transitioning to civilian careers. They believe your example could inspire other veterans to find meaningful ways to continue serving their communities. Margaret considered this. The idea of being featured in a government recruitment video felt strange, but if her story could help other veterans find purpose in their post-military lives, it might be worth the additional exposure. I'll consider it, she said. But right now, I'm focused on getting back to Millbrook and starting my new role. When Margaret returned to Millbrook, she found that the community had not forgotten her story. A banner had been hung across Main Street reading, "Welcome home, hero," and the mayor had scheduled a ceremony to officially recognize her new role as the region's first SUT coordinator. But the recognition that meant the most to Margaret came from the children at Lincoln Elementary. When she arrived for her first day as both crossing guard and director of aviation safety education, she found a group of students waiting for her with handmade signs and drawings of helicopters. Mrs. Chen called Emma Rodriguez, who had become something of a celebrity herself as the patient whose life had been saved. "We made these for you." Margaret looked at the drawings, helicopters in crayon, stick figures of herself in her orange safety vest, and pictures of airplanes with messages like, "Thank you for saving Emma, and you're the best crossing guard ever." "These are beautiful," Margaret said, genuinely moved. "I'm going to hang them in my new office." "You have an office now?" asked Tommy Martinez. "I do. And next week, I'm going to start teaching aviation safety classes." "Who wants to learn about helicopters?" Every hand in the group shot up, and Margaret laughed. "I think we're going to need a bigger classroom." Margaret's new office was in the school's administrative building, equipped with communication equipment that connected her to air traffic control, emergency services, and other CERT coordinators across the region. On her first official day, she received a call that reminded her why this work was so important. "SOUT Coordinator Chen, this is Regional Air Traffic Control. We have a small aircraft experiencing navigation difficulties approximately 20 miles north of your location. The pilot is a student on a solo cross-country flight, and weather conditions are deteriorating. We need you to identify potential emergency landing sites in the area." Margaret immediately pulled up the mapping software she had been trained to use, her mind automatically cataloging the open areas in the region that could accommodate a small aircraft. "I have several options," she said. "The best choice is probably the regional airport, but if that's not accessible due to weather, there's a large farm field about 15 miles north that would work for an emergency landing. Can you provide GPS coordinates for the farm field?" Margaret rattled off the coordinates, then added, "I can also deploy to the site if needed. I have mobile communication equipment and can provide ground support for the landing. Stand by, SOC coordinator." As Margaret waited for instructions, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency situations. This was what she had trained for, what she had been preparing for during her 6 weeks of CERT training. But it was also what she had been preparing for during her 25 years of military service and her 8 years as a crossing guard, the moment when her skills and experience could make a difference in someone's life. "SOUT Coordinator Chen, proceed to the farm field location. The pilot has been instructed to attempt landing at the regional airport, but we want you in position as backup in case the weather prevents that approach." Margaret grabbed her emergency equipment bag and headed for her car, which was now equipped with emergency lights and communication equipment. As she drove toward the farm field, she called the local emergency services to coordinate their response. "This is CERT Coordinator Chen. I'm deploying to a potential aircraft emergency landing site. I need fire and rescue units to stage at the intersection of County Road 15 and Maple Avenue, prepared to respond to either the regional airport or the farm field location." "Copy that, Coordinator Chen. Units are en route." When Margaret arrived at the farm field, she quickly assessed the site and established communication with the pilot. The young aviator was clearly nervous, but maintaining control of the aircraft. The weather was indeed deteriorating, with low clouds and increasing wind, but it wasn't yet dangerous enough to prevent a landing. "Student pilot, this is CERT Ground Control. I have visual contact with your aircraft. The regional airport is your best option, but I have a clear backup landing site if needed. What is your current fuel status?" "Ground control. I have about 30 minutes of fuel remaining. I'm going to try for the airport." Margaret monitored the situation as the pilot successfully landed at the regional airport, guided by air traffic control. The emergency equipment she had coordinated stood down, and the young aviator was safely on the ground. It was a small incident, routine in many ways, but it was also a perfect example of how the C program was designed to work. Margaret had used her local knowledge, her aviation expertise, and her communication skills to provide a safety net for an emergency situation. The pilot had ultimately not needed her help, but knowing that support was available had probably made the difference between a successful landing and a potential disaster. When Margaret returned to Lincoln Elementary for the afternoon crossing guard duty, she found Principal Rodriguez waiting for her. "How did it go?" Principal Rodriguez asked. "Routine, but important," Margaret replied. "A student pilot had some navigation difficulties, but everything worked out fine. That's how most of these situations will be. Preparation and positioning so that if something goes wrong, we're ready to help." "Just like being a crossing guard," Principal Rodriguez observed. "Most of the time, nothing dramatic happens. But when it does, you're there to keep people safe." Margaret smiled. "Exactly. Whether it's helping children cross the street or helping aircraft land safely, it's all about being prepared and being there when people need you." As Margaret took her position at the school crossing, she reflected on how perfectly her two roles complemented each other. The crossing guard work kept her connected to the community, aware of the daily rhythms and needs of the people she served. The SUT coordinator role allowed her to use her specialized skills to protect that same community from a different kind of danger. Both roles required vigilance, preparation, and the willingness to take responsibility for others' safety. Both required her to be someone others could count on when things went wrong. And both roles allowed her to serve her community in ways that made a real difference in people's lives. Margaret realized that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a way to be both the person she had always been and the person she was meant to become. The helicopter landing had revealed her true identity, but it had also revealed her true calling, to be a guardian, a teacher, and a servant of her community in whatever way was needed most. 3 months after the helicopter landing that changed everything, Margaret stood in front of her first official aviation safety class at Lincoln Elementary. The classroom was packed with 30 eager students, ranging from 3rd graders to 6th graders, all of whom had signed up for what the school was calling Mrs. Chen's Flight Academy. "Good morning, future aviators," Margaret said, and was rewarded with a chorus of excited, "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," from the students. Emma Rodriguez sat in the front row, her notebook already open and her pencil ready. Since their first meeting, she had become Margaret's most enthusiastic student, devouring every book about aviation that Margaret recommended and asking increasingly sophisticated questions about aircraft and flight. Today, we're going to learn about the basic principles of flight, Margaret continued. But before we do that, I want to ask you a question. How many of you have ever been in an airplane? About half the hands in the room went up. And how many of you have ever wondered how something as heavy as an airplane can fly through the air? This time, nearly every hand shot up, and Margaret smiled. This was exactly the kind of curiosity and wonder that she hoped to cultivate in her students. Well, you're about to find out. But first, let me tell you about the day I learned to fly. Margaret told them about her first flight lesson, 28 years earlier, when she was a young Army officer learning to pilot helicopters. She described the feeling of lifting off the ground for the first time, the sense of freedom and responsibility that came with controlling an aircraft, and the years of training and practice that had made her a skilled pilot. But flying isn't just about being in the cockpit, she said. It's about understanding how aircraft work, how to be safe around them, and how to help in emergency situations. That's what we're going to learn together. The students were captivated as Margaret explained the 4 forces of flight: lift, thrust, drag, and weight, using simple demonstrations and hands-on activities. She had them make paper airplanes and experiment with different designs, helping them understand how changing the shape of the wings affected how the planes flew. Mrs. Chen asked a 4th grader named Michael, "Is it true that you helped land a helicopter just by talking on the radio?" Margaret smiled. "It's true that I provided ground support for an emergency helicopter landing. But the pilot did all the hard work. I just helped by providing information and guidance." "But how did you know what to say?" asked Sarah Kim, the girl who had been afraid of the school bus and had become one of Margaret's most regular crosswalk students. "Because I've been in similar situations myself," Margaret replied. "When you're a pilot, you train for emergencies all the time. You practice what to do if your engine fails, if your radio stops working, if the weather gets bad. The training becomes automatic, so when a real emergency happens, you know what to do." Tommy Martinez raised his hand. "Could you teach us how to talk to pilots on the radio?" Margaret considered this. "That's an advanced skill, but maybe we can learn about basic aviation communication. First, though, let's make sure you understand how aircraft work and how to be safe around them." The class flew by, literally, as Margaret had the students use their paper airplanes to demonstrate concepts like air pressure, wind resistance, and controlled flight. By the end of the session, every student had successfully flown their handmade aircraft across the room and could explain in basic terms why it worked. "For next week," Margaret said as the class ended, "I want you to observe aircraft in the sky. Look for airplanes, helicopters, and even birds. Notice how they move, how they turn, how they land. We'll talk about what you observe." Emma Rodriguez stayed after class, as she often did. "Mrs. Chen, I've been reading about helicopter pilots, and I found out that not very many of them are women. Is that true?" Margaret nodded. "It's true that there are fewer women pilots than men, but that's changing. When I started flying, there were very few women in military aviation. Now there are many more, and the number keeps growing. Do you think I could really become a pilot someday?" Margaret looked at the determined 8-year-old in front of her and saw something that reminded her of herself at that age: curiosity, courage, and an unwillingness to accept limitations. "Emma, I think you can become anything you set your mind to. If you want to be a pilot, you'll need to study hard, especially in math and science. You'll need to stay physically fit and learn to make good decisions under pressure. But if you're willing to work for it, yes, I think you could be an excellent pilot." Emma's face lit up. "Will you help me?" "I'll help you as much as I can," Margaret promised. "And who knows? Maybe someday you'll be the one helping someone else achieve their dreams." After Emma left, Margaret sat in her classroom looking at the drawings of aircraft that the students had made during class. Each one was different, reflecting the unique imagination and creativity of its creator. Some were realistic representations of commercial airliners. Others were fantastical flying machines that defied the laws of physics. All of them represented dreams and possibilities. Margaret thought about her own journey from that first flight. Lesson to this moment. She had never imagined that her military training would lead to a career as a crossing guard, or that her crossing guard experience would lead to a role as an emergency coordinator and aviation educator. Life had a way of connecting experiences and skills in unexpected ways. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Martinez. Saw the news article about your aviation class. Looks like you're inspiring the next generation of pilots. Well done. Margaret smiled. The local newspaper had indeed run a story about the new aviation safety program, featuring photos of the students with their paper airplanes and quotes from parents about how excited their children were to learn about flight. The article had been picked up by aviation publications, and Margaret had received calls from other school districts interested in starting similar programs. But the real measure of success wasn't the media attention or the recognition from the aviation community. It was the spark of curiosity and wonder she saw in her students' eyes, the questions they asked, the dreams they were beginning to form. Margaret packed up her materials and headed back to her crossing guard post. The afternoon dismissal was beginning, and there would be hundreds of children who needed her help getting safely across the street. Some of them would be her aviation students, excited to share what they had learned with their parents. Others would be potential future students, curious about the crossing guard, who also taught people how to fly. As she put on her orange safety vest and picked up her stop sign, Margaret realized that all of her roles, crossing guard, SATA coordinator, and aviation educator, were really the same job. She was a guardian, someone who helped people navigate safely from one place to another, whether that was across a street, through an emergency, or toward their dreams. And for the first time since that helicopter landed in the old factory site, Margaret felt completely at peace with who she had become. 6 months after the helicopter landing, Margaret had settled into her new routine. Her days began at Lincoln Elementary as a crossing guard, continued with her aviation safety classes, and included periodic calls as the regional SATE coordinator. She had handled a dozen minor aviation incidents, lost pilots, mechanical issues, and weather-related emergencies, but nothing as dramatic as that first helicopter landing. That changed on a gray Tuesday morning in March. Margaret was conducting her usual morning crossing guard duties when she heard the familiar sound of aircraft engines overhead. But these weren't the normal commercial flights that passed over Millbrook. These engines had a different sound, larger, more powerful, and there were multiple aircraft. Looking up, Margaret saw something that made her blood run cold. A formation of military cargo planes was flying much lower than normal, and one of them was clearly in distress. Black smoke was trailing from its left engine, and the aircraft was losing altitude rapidly. Margaret immediately pulled out her SART. Radio. Regional Control. This is SART Coordinator Chen. I have visual contact with a military cargo aircraft in distress, approximately 2 miles southwest of Lincoln Elementary. The aircraft appears to have engine failure and is losing altitude rapidly. SART Coordinator Chen, we copy. Are you certain it's a military aircraft? Margaret studied the formation through her binoculars. Affirmative. It appears to be a C-130 Hercules, and it's flying in formation with 3 other aircraft. The lead aircraft is trailing black smoke and has lost significant altitude. SART Coordinator Chen, we're alerting military air traffic control. Stand by for instructions. Margaret's mind raced through the possibilities. A C-130 was a massive aircraft, much larger than the medical helicopter she had helped land. If it went down in the residential area, the consequences could be catastrophic. But C-130s were also robust aircraft, capable of landing on rough terrain if necessary. Her radio crackled again. SART Coordinator Chen, This is Colonel Anderson with Air Force Emergency Operations. We understand you're tracking our aircraft. Can you provide current position and heading? Colonel Anderson, the aircraft is now approximately 1 mile southwest of my position, heading northeast at low altitude. The smoke trail is increasing, and the aircraft is continuing to lose altitude. It appears the pilot is looking for a landing. Site: Site Coordinator Chen. We need you to identify the best emergency landing options in the area. Our pilot is going to need a long, clear runway or a very large open area. Margaret's mind immediately went to the regional airport, but she knew it probably wasn't long enough for a damaged C-130. The high school football field was too small. The shopping center parking lot was too congested. And then she remembered something that made her heart race. Colonel Anderson, there's a possibility that might work. The state is building a new highway bypass around Millbrook. They've cleared and graded about 2 miles of roadway, but it hasn't been paved yet. It's essentially a long, straight, cleared runway about 3 miles east of the elementary school. Can you provide exact coordinates? Margaret rattled off the GPS coordinates, then added, Colonel, I can deploy to the site immediately. I have mobile communication equipment and can provide ground support for the landing. Site Coordinator Chen, are you qualified to handle military aircraft emergencies? Colonel, I'm a retired Army helicopter pilot with 25 years of service. I've handled emergency landings before, including in combat zones. There was a pause, then Colonel Anderson's voice came back, more urgent. Site Coordinator Chen, proceed to the highway site immediately. Our pilot is running out of options, and we need someone on the ground who knows what they're doing. Margaret quickly called Principal Rodriguez to explain the situation, then jumped in her car and raced toward the highway construction site. As she drove, she could see the C-130 in the distance, still trailing smoke, with the other aircraft in formation providing support. When she arrived at the construction site, Margaret quickly assessed the situation. The cleared roadway was indeed long enough for a C-130 landing, but there were obstacles that would need to be addressed. Construction equipment was parked along the sides of the roadway, and there were several hills of gravel and dirt that could interfere with the aircraft's approach. Margaret immediately called the construction company's emergency number. This is Site Coordinator Chen with a Federal Aviation emergency. I need all construction equipment moved away from the cleared roadway immediately. We have a military aircraft attempting an emergency landing. While the construction crew scrambled to move their equipment, Margaret established communication with the C-130 pilot. Military aircraft in distress. This is CERT ground control at emergency landing site. I have a clear runway approximately 2 miles long and 100 feet wide. Construction equipment is being moved now. What is your current status? CERT ground control. This is Air Force 17 Charlie. We have lost our number 2 engine and are experiencing control difficulties. We need to land immediately. Can you confirm the runway is clear? Margaret watched as the last piece of construction equipment was moved away from the roadway. Air Force 17 Charlie, runway is clear. You have a straight approach from the southwest with no obstacles. Wind is calm. I'll guide you in. The C-130 was now close enough that Margaret could see the pilot through the cockpit windows. The aircraft was much larger than the medical helicopter, and the landing would be correspondingly more challenging. But Margaret could see that the pilot was skilled and maintaining control despite the mechanical failure. Air Force 17 Charlie. You're lined up perfectly. Maintain current heading and prepare for landing. You have plenty of runway. CERT ground control. This is going to be a hard landing. We're coming in fast due to the engine failure. Copy that, Air Force 17 Charlie. Emergency vehicles are standing by. You're looking good. Margaret watched as the massive cargo plane approached the makeshift runway. The pilot was doing everything right, maintaining airspeed, keeping the aircraft stable, and preparing for what would essentially be a controlled crash landing. 100 to 130 touched down hard, bounced once, and then settled onto the cleared roadway with a tremendous roar of engines and squealing of brakes. Margaret held her breath as the aircraft rolled down the improvised runway, gradually slowing as the pilot applied maximum braking. The plane finally came to a stop about 3/4 of the way down the cleared roadway, surrounded by clouds of dust and smoke. Margaret immediately radioed the emergency services. "All units, the aircraft is down safe. No fire visible. Aircraft appears intact. Moving to assist crew." Margaret drove quickly to where the C-130 had stopped and was relieved to see the crew already beginning to exit the aircraft. The pilot was a young captain, probably in his late 20s, who looked shaken but uninjured. "CERT ground control, I presume?" the pilot said as Margaret approached. "Captain Margaret Chen, retired Army Aviation," Margaret replied. "How are you and your crew?" "We're all fine, thanks to you." "That was incredible ground support. How did you know about this landing site?" "Local knowledge," Margaret said with a smile. "Sometimes being part of the community means knowing about every open space that could save lives." As emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft and the crew was checked by medics, Margaret realized that this landing had been even more challenging than the helicopter emergency. The stakes had been higher, the aircraft larger, and the potential for catastrophe greater. But once again, her combination of aviation expertise and local knowledge had made the difference between a successful emergency landing and a potential disaster. Colonel Anderson arrived by helicopter 30 minutes later and personally thanked Margaret for her assistance. "CERT Coordinator Chen, what you did today was extraordinary. You saved not just the lives of our aircrew, but potentially hundreds of people on the ground who could have been in danger if that aircraft had gone down in a populated area." Margaret felt the familiar mixture of pride and humility that came with successfully completing a difficult mission. "I just did what I was trained to do, Colonel." That's what the CERT program is all about, being prepared to help when aircraft emergencies occur. As Margaret drove back to Lincoln Elementary, she realized that her role as a CERT coordinator was becoming more significant than anyone had initially imagined. 2 major aircraft emergencies in 6 months was unusual for any region, and her involvement in both successful landings was beginning to attract attention from aviation authorities across the country. But more importantly, she was beginning to understand that her unique combination of skills, aviation expertise, local knowledge, and community connections made her incredibly valuable in ways that went far beyond emergency response. She was becoming a bridge between the aviation world and the civilian community, helping both sides understand each other better and work together more effectively. Margaret returned to her crossing guard post just in time for the afternoon dismissal. As children began emerging from the school, several of them ran up to her with obvious excitement. "Mrs. Chen, we saw the airplane land," called Tommy Martinez. "Was that another emergency?" "It was," Margaret replied. "And just like with the helicopter, everyone made it safely to the ground. Are you going to tell us about it in aviation class?" asked Emma Rodriguez. Margaret smiled. "I think that would make an excellent lesson about emergency procedures and the importance of being prepared for unexpected situations." As she helped the children cross the street safely, Margaret reflected on the strange and wonderful turns her life had taken. She had come to Millbrook 8 years ago seeking peace and anonymity. Instead, she had found purpose, community, and a calling that used every skill she had ever learned in service of others. The quiet crossing guard, who had wanted nothing more than to help children safely cross the street, had become something much more: a guardian of the skies, a teacher of future aviators, and a bridge between worlds. And she was just getting started. The C-130 emergency landing made national news within hours. Unlike the medical helicopter incident, which had been primarily a local story that grew over time. The military aircraft emergency immediately captured the attention of major news networks, aviation publications, and government officials. Margaret's phone began ringing before she even got home that evening. The first call was from CNN, wanting to schedule a live interview about her role in the emergency landing. The second was from the Pentagon, requesting a detailed report on the incident. The third was from the FAA, asking her to participate in a conference call with senior aviation officials. But the call that surprised her most came from General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of the Army Aviation Center, who had left her a message months earlier. "Captain Chen," General Hayes said, using Margaret's former rank, "I've been following your story since the medical helicopter incident. And now with this military aircraft emergency, I think it's time we had a serious conversation about your future. General Hayes, I appreciate your interest, but I'm very happy with my current role here in Millbrook." "I'm not talking about asking you to leave Millbrook," General Hayes replied. "I'm talking about expanding your role to serve as a model for other communities. What you've accomplished could revolutionize how we handle aviation emergencies in civilian areas." Margaret found herself intrigued despite her initial reluctance. "What did you have in mind?" "I want you to consider joining a new Department of Defense initiative called the Civilian Military Aviation Coordination Program. You'd remain based in Millbrook, continue your current responsibilities, but you'd also help develop training programs for other communities and serve as a regional coordinator for aviation emergencies." The offer was tempting, but Margaret had learned to be cautious about taking on too much responsibility. "General, can I think about this? I'd need to understand exactly what would be involved." "Of course. But Captain Chen, I want you to know that what you've done is unprecedented. 2 successful emergency aircraft landings in 6 months, using nothing but local knowledge and excellent training. The aviation community is taking notice." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her kitchen, looking at the medals and certificates that had accumulated over the past months. She had been honored by the FAA, recognized by the state government, and featured in aviation magazines. But the recognition that meant the most to her was still the handmade cards and drawings from her students. The next morning brought another surprise. Principal Rodriguez called her into the office to meet with a visitor, Dr. Amanda Foster, the superintendent of the state education department. "Miss Chen," Dr. Foster said, "I've been following your work with great interest. The aviation safety program you've developed at Lincoln Elementary is exactly the kind of innovative, practical education that we want to see in schools across the state." Margaret felt a familiar sense of apprehension. "Dr. Foster, I appreciate your interest, but I'm not sure I'm ready to take on additional responsibilities." "I understand your hesitation," Dr. Foster said, "but what I'm proposing wouldn't require you to leave Millbrook or give up your current roles. We want to create a statewide aviation education program, with you as the lead curriculum developer and master trainer. Other teachers would come here to learn from you, and you'd help them implement similar programs in their schools." Margaret considered this. Unlike the other offers she had received, this one would allow her to remain rooted in her community while sharing her knowledge more broadly. "Would this interfere with my crossing guard duties or my SART responsibilities?" "Not at all, Doctor," Foster replied. "We recognize that your effectiveness comes from your deep connection to this community. We want to enhance that, not replace it." That afternoon, Margaret stood at her crossing guard post, watching the familiar stream of children and parents, thinking about all the opportunities that were being presented to her. The quiet life she had sought in Millbrook was definitely over, but what was emerging in its place was something she had never imagined possible. Emma Rodriguez approached her after school, carrying a thick folder. "Mrs. Chen, I've been working on something for you," Emma said, handing her the folder. "It's my application to the Civil Air Patrol Cadet Program. I want to start learning about aviation officially." Margaret opened the folder to find a meticulously prepared application, complete with essays about why Emma wanted to pursue aviation and what she hoped to learn. At 8 years old, Emma was too young for the cadet program, but her preparation and determination were remarkable. "Emma, this is incredible work. But you know you need to be at least 12 to join the Civil Air Patrol, right?" "I know," Emma said, "but I wanted to be ready. And I was hoping you might help me find other ways to learn about aviation while I wait." Margaret smiled, remembering her own childhood dreams of flying. "I think I can help with that. In fact, I might have some exciting news about new aviation programs soon." Margaret smiled, remembering her own childhood dreams of flying. "I think I can help with that. In fact, I might have some exciting news about new aviation programs soon." As Emma walked away, Margaret realized that her decision about the state education program had just been made for her. If she could inspire students like Emma to pursue their dreams, if she could help create opportunities for young people to explore aviation careers, then she had a responsibility to do so. That evening, Margaret called Dr. Foster back. "I'm interested in the state aviation education program," she said. "But I have some conditions. I'm listening. First, I want Emma Rodriguez to be part of the pilot program, even though she's younger than the typical age range. Second, I want to make sure that the program emphasizes both the technical aspects of aviation and the service aspects, how aviation skills can be used to help communities. And third, I want to maintain my crossing guard position at Lincoln Elementary." "Those all sound reasonable," Dr. Foster said. "When can you start?" Margaret looked out her window at the street corner where she had spent 8 years helping children cross safely, then at the sky where she had recently helped 2 aircraft land safely. "I can start next month. But I'll need to coordinate with my other commitments." The next morning, Margaret arrived at Lincoln Elementary to find a news crew waiting for her. The reporter was Sarah Williams, the same journalist who had first interviewed her after the helicopter landing. "Miss Chen, we're here to follow up on your story. You've now been involved in 2 major aviation emergencies. You've developed and coded an innovative education program, and you're being recognized nationally for your work. How has your life changed since that first helicopter landing?" Margaret thought about the question carefully. 8 months ago, I was just a crossing guard who wanted a quiet life. I thought I had left my military service behind me. But what I've learned is that you can't really leave behind the skills and experiences that make you who you are. The helicopter emergency didn't change me. It revealed who I had always been. "And who is that?" "Someone who serves others," Margaret said simply. "Whether that's helping children cross the street safely, or helping aircraft land safely, or helping students learn about aviation, it's all the same job. I'm someone who helps people get safely from where they are to where they need to be." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Margaret discussing her new role in the state education program, her continued work as a state coordinator, and her plans for expanding aviation education. When the news crew left, Margaret put on her orange safety vest and took her position at the school crossing. As she did every morning, she checked her radio, looked up at the sky, and prepared to help her community navigate another day safely. But this time, she also looked forward to the possibilities that lay ahead. The aviation education program would reach hundreds of students across the state. The SOT coordination work would help protect communities throughout the region, and her crossing guard duties would continue to keep her grounded in the daily life of Millbrook. Margaret realized that she had found something remarkable, a way to serve others that used all of her skills, honored all of her experiences, and connected her to both her past and her future. She was no longer just a crossing guard who happened to be a former military pilot. She was a guardian, a teacher, and a bridge between worlds. As the first children began arriving for school, Margaret smiled and prepared for another day of helping people safely reach their destinations. Some would be crossing the street, others would be learning about aviation, and still others might be pilots in distress who needed guidance to safety. All of them would find in Margaret Chen exactly what they needed, someone who understood that the most important journey is the one that brings people safely home. Tommy Martinez ran up to her, as he did every morning, slightly out of breath and always running a few minutes late. "Mrs. Chen, my mom says you're going to be famous now because of all the airplanes you've helped." Margaret laughed. "I'm not famous, Tommy. I'm just someone who helps people when they need it. Just like you help your little sister tie her shoes. Or like your mom helps you with your homework. We all help each other. But you help with helicopters and airplanes. And you help with shoelaces and homework," Margaret replied. "Both are important. Both make the world a better place." As Tommy ran off toward school, Margaret reflected on the truth of what she had told him. The helicopter landings had been dramatic and had captured public attention, but they were just visible examples of something that happened every day in communities, everywhere. People using their skills and knowledge to help others. Margaret was ready for whatever came next, whether it was another aviation emergency, a new group of students eager to learn about flight, or simply another day of helping children cross the street safely. She had learned that serving others wasn't about the size or drama of the task. It was about being present, prepared, and willing to help when help was needed. The quiet crossing guard, who had wanted nothing more than anonymity, had become something much more important, a reminder that heroes are often hiding in plain sight, that skills learned in one chapter of life can serve others in unexpected ways, and that the most meaningful work is often the work of helping people safely reach their destinations, one step at a time. 1 year after the helicopter landing that changed everything, Margaret Chen stood at the podium in the Lincoln Elementary Auditorium, looking out at an audience that would have been unimaginable to her just 12 months earlier. The room was packed with students, parents, teachers, aviation professionals, military personnel, and government officials, all gathered to celebrate the first anniversary of the Millbrook Aviation Safety Program. "A year ago," Margaret began, "I was just a crossing guard who wanted a quiet life. I thought I had left my military service behind me, and I was content to spend my days helping children cross the street safely. I never imagined that a single emergency would change not just my life, but the lives of so many others." In the front row, Emma Rodriguez sat with her parents, wearing the uniform of the Civil Air Patrol Cadet Program. At 9 years old, she was still younger than the typical cadet, but her exceptional knowledge and dedication had earned her a special place in the program. Next to her sat the other students from the first aviation safety class, many of whom had gone on to pursue advanced aviation programs. "But what I've learned," Margaret continued, "is that we never really leave behind the skills and experiences that make us who we are. The helicopter emergency didn't change me. It revealed who I had always been. It showed me that serving others isn't about the uniform you wear or the title you hold. It's about being present, prepared, and willing to help when help is needed." Margaret looked toward the back of the auditorium, where Captain Sarah Martinez sat with her medical flight crew. The helicopter pilot had become a regular visitor to Millbrook, often stopping by to check on the aviation program and to participate in emergency response training exercises. "Today, I want to tell you about some of the wonderful things that have happened because of that emergency landing," Margaret said. "We now have aviation safety programs in 47 schools across the state. We have a regional network of civilian aviation emergency coordinators. We have students who are pursuing pilot training and aviation careers. And we have a community that understands that heroes are often hiding in plain sight." Margaret's voice grew warmer as she continued. "But the most important thing we've accomplished is something simpler and more profound. We've created a community where people look out for each other, where skills and knowledge are shared freely, and where everyone understands that they have something valuable to contribute. The audience applauded as Margaret introduced the various speakers who would share their stories. Colonel Anderson spoke about the importance of civilian-military cooperation in emergency response. Dr. Foster discussed the expansion of aviation education programs. Captain Martinez talked about the ongoing collaboration between medical helicopter services and local communities. But the presentation that moved Margaret most was given by Emma Rodriguez herself. Mrs. Chen taught me that dreams are just plans that haven't happened yet, Emma said, her voice clear and confident despite her young age. She showed me that if you want to fly, you have to start by learning everything you can about aviation. If you want to help people, you have to be ready when they need you. And if you want to make a difference in your community, you have to be willing to serve others. Emma went on to describe her plans for the future, earning her pilot's license, attending the Air Force Academy, and eventually becoming a helicopter pilot like Margaret. But she also talked about her current responsibilities as a junior aviation safety instructor, helping younger students learn about aircraft and flight. Mrs. Chen showed me that serving others isn't something you do when you're grown up, Emma said. It's something you do every day in whatever way you can. Right now I serve by helping other kids learn about aviation safety. Someday, I hope to serve by helping people in emergency situations, just like Mrs. Chen does. After the formal presentations, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers and colleagues. But the conversation that meant the most to her was with Mrs. Patterson, her elderly neighbor who had been one of the first to witness the helicopter emergency. Margaret, Mrs. Patterson said, I've been thinking about what you said in your speech, about how the emergency revealed who you had always been. I think that's true, but I also think there's more to it than that. What do you mean? I think the emergency revealed not just who you were, but who you were meant to become. You were a wonderful crossing guard, but you were also someone with so much more to offer. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us our true potential. Margaret smiled. Maybe you're right. I certainly never imagined I'd be doing all of this when I first moved to Millbrook. But you're still our crossing guard, Mrs. Patterson said. That's what I love about your story. You didn't abandon what you were doing, you expanded it. You're still the same person who helps people get safely from one place to another. You just help them in more ways now. That evening, after all, the guests had gone home and the auditorium was empty. Margaret walked to her old crossing guard post at the corner of Maple and Lincoln. It was after dark, and there were no children to help across the street, but she wanted to spend a few minutes at the place where her transformation had begun. As she stood there, Margaret reflected on everything that had happened in the past year. She had helped coordinate responses to 16 aviation emergencies, trained 12 new SOUT coordinators, developed aviation curriculum for schools across the state, and spoken at conferences from coast to coast. Her quiet life in Millbrook had become a platform for national service, but she had also continued to serve as a crossing guard every morning and afternoon, helping hundreds of children safely cross the street. She had maintained her apartment in Millbrook, stayed connected to her neighbors, and preserved the community relationships that had made everything else possible. Margaret realized that this was the key to her success. She had never tried to choose between her old life and her new opportunities. Instead, she had found ways to integrate them, to use each role to strengthen the others. Her crossing guard work kept her grounded in the community she served. Her SART coordination work allowed her to protect that community from aviation emergencies. Her education work helped ensure that future generations would have the knowledge and skills to serve others. Her phone buzzed with a text. Message from Captain Martinez. Saw the news coverage of your anniversary event. Congratulations on an incredible year. Looking forward to working with you on the new Regional Training Center. Margaret smiled. The Regional Training Center was the latest project, a facility that would train civilian aviation emergency coordinators from across the country. It would be located just outside Millbrook, ensuring that Margaret could continue her crossing guard duties while also serving as the center's director. As she walked home, Margaret passed the old factory site where the helicopter had landed a year earlier. The area had been developed into a community park with a small memorial plaque commemorating the emergency landing. But more importantly, the park included a model aircraft display and an outdoor classroom where Margaret often held aviation safety classes during good weather. Margaret stopped at the memorial plaque and read the inscription. In recognition of the emergency landing of Metro Emergency Medical Services Flight 429 on this site, and in honor of all those who serve their communities with courage, skill, and dedication. The plaque didn't mention her by name, which was exactly how Margaret had wanted it. The emergency landing had been a team effort involving the pilot, the medical crew, the emergency responders, and the community members who had helped. Her role had been important, but it had been just one part of a larger story of people working together to save lives. As Margaret reached her apartment, she found a package waiting for her. Inside was a flight suit sent by the new class of aviation safety students at a school in California. They had embroidered a patch on the chest that read, "Guardian of the Skies," and included a note. "Thank you for showing us that heroes can be found anywhere, and that the most important skill is the willingness to help others." Margaret hung the Hyundai flight suit in her closet, next to her orange crossing guard vest. The two garments represented different aspects of her service, but they also represented the same fundamental commitment: to use her skills and knowledge to help others safely reach their destinations. The next morning, Margaret woke up at 6:30 a.m., just as she had every day for the past 9 years. She put on her orange safety vest, checked her radio, and walked to Lincoln Elementary School. At 7:15 a.m. sharp, she took her position at the corner of Maple and Lincoln, ready to help children cross the street safely. But now, as she stood at her familiar post, Margaret also carried with her the knowledge that she was part of something larger. She was connected to aviation safety instructors across the country, to emergency coordinators throughout the region, and to students who were pursuing their own dreams of flight. She was a crossing guard, but she was also a teacher, a coordinator, a mentor, and a guardian of the skies. As the first children began arriving for school, Margaret smiled and prepared for another day of helping people safely reach their destinations. Some would be crossing the street, others would be learning about aviation, and still others might be pilots in distress who needed guidance to safety. All of them would find in Margaret Chen exactly what they needed: someone who understood that the most important journey is the one that brings people safely home, and that the most meaningful work is often the work of helping others, one step at a time. They had called her just a crossing guard, but she had become so much more. Not by abandoning who she was, but by embracing all of who she could be. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone around her that extraordinary people are often hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when their skills and courage are needed most. Margaret Chen, crossing guard and guardian of the skies, was ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories and meaningful content. And most importantly, stay hopeful and keep moving forward, because brighter days are ahead. Thanks again for watching, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you soon. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.